When we look at global conflicts and the absolute devastation of war, we almost always rely on things like political science, history, or military strategy to make sense of all the chaos, right? But what happens when we look at war through the lens of human psychology? Today, in this explainer, our focal point is the incredibly powerful docudrama, The Voice of Hind Rajab. And by looking at this film, we're going to explore how the devastating reality of war, a chinchang, doesn't just fracture physical infrastructure, but it literally fractures the very psychological framework of an entire society.
Okay, let's dive into this. The source material we're examining today centers on a deeply tragic reality. This docudrama reconstructs the final, harrowing moments of Hind Rajab. She was a 6-year-old Palestinian girl trapped in a vehicle right in the middle of a deadly war zone. The reality of war is so often presented to us in massive, almost incomprehensible statistics, right? Thousands displaced, entire city blocks destroyed. But this docudrama, it forces us to look at the micro level. It zeroes in on the raw, terrifying experience of just one single child caught directly in the crossfire of systemic violence. But before we introduce our actual analytical framework, we really have to acknowledge the profound emotional weight of this reality. The film is built around real-life audio recordings. These are Hind's literal cries for help over the phone to emergency dispatchers. She was completely isolated, surrounded by the devastating realities of combat, and just terrified in the dark. Grounding our analysis in clinical empathy is absolutely crucial here. We simply cannot understand the psychology of a war system without first recognizing the intense, agonizing human suffering that it produces at its absolute core. Section 1. Shifting the lens. Internal family systems.
So, to help us make sense of this totally chaotic system, we're moving from that raw emotional trauma to a much more objective, highly structured framework. It's called Internal Family Systems, or IFS. Now, originally, IFS was developed for individual therapy. It views a person as containing multiple, interacting subpersonalities or parts that take on specific roles to manage trauma. But here is where it gets absolutely fascinating. We can actually scale this up. We can view entire societies and systems in exactly the same way. Now, I want to be super clear here. We aren't here to assign geopolitical blame today. Not at all. Instead, we're using IFS to completely impartially map the psychological roles that emerge during the extreme stress of a conflict.
Section 2. Mapping the war zone parts. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly the reality of this war zone actually aligns with the IFS model. We're going to categorize the real-world actors from the docudrama into specific psychological categories. Let's look at the 3 columns here. First up, we have the exiles. In IFS, exiles are the wounded, vulnerable parts holding profound pain and terror. Hind Rajab perfectly symbolizes this. She's the wounded child, isolated and crying out. Next, we have the managers. These parts try to maintain control, keep the system functioning. The Red Crescent medics on the phone represent the managers. They're desperately trying to solve the problem, keep her calm, and coordinate a rescue in the middle of total chaos. And finally, we have the firefighters. In IFS, when the system is just completely overwhelmed, firefighters rush in to extinguish the pain through extreme, impulsive, and often really destructive actions. The warring factions and military forces represent these firefighters. They're reacting with extreme violence, basically prioritizing the destruction of a perceived threat over the safety of the vulnerable exile. Section 3. The diagnosis. Absence of self-leadership. So think about it. If we have all these parts frantically operating, exiles suffering, managers organizing, firefighters destroying, who's actually in charge? What happens when the central guiding force of a system just vanishes entirely? Well, in a healthy system, whether that's an individual or a society, there's a core leader called the self. And the self is characterized by 4 essential traits. We see them on the slide here: calmness, curiosity, connectedness, and compassion. When the self leads, the system can actually heal. But look closely at these 4 words: calmness, curiosity, connectedness, compassion. These are the exact qualities that are entirely missing from the political and military actors in a war zone. The overarching self of the societal system has literally collapsed. And this brilliantly illustrates just how stark the contrast is. On one side, you have this hypothetical system guided by a compassionate self, protecting the vulnerable. But on the other side, you have the fractured reality of war we see in the docudrama. In this reality, the managers and firefighters, which IFS collectively calls protectors, well, they've become so rigid, so aggressive, and so dominant that they block all human connection. These extreme protective measures actually crush empathy and prevent any chance of systemic healing. The protectors have completely taken over, and the self is just nowhere to be found.
Section 4. Inherited burdens and systemic overload.
So you might be wondering, why do these parts become so extreme in the first place? Why the devastating violence? Well, the IFS framework offers a deeply compassionate tenet here. These extreme parts are not inherently evil. They are simply overloaded. In the context of this conflict, the system is failing because these protective parts are carrying massive inherited burdens. We are talking about generations, literally generations of accumulated fear, trauma, and hatred. War doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? It's the result of a system collapsing under the crushing weight of these historical burdens. And that causes the protective parts to act out in highly destructive, militarized ways purely because they believe it's the only way to survive.
Section 5. Witnessing to heal, the film as intervention. So the crucial point is, if the system is this broken, how do we even begin to fix it? And that is the entire purpose of the docudrama itself. It acts as an active, urgent psychological intervention. It's literally a tool for systemic change. IFS tells us that healing cannot happen until the exile is truly seen and heard. So step 1 is witnessing. By forcing us to listen to Hind's voice, the director ensures we witness the exile's pain without turning away, without intellectualizing it or hiding behind political debates. Step 2 is what follows. By witnessing this pain, we begin to evoke those missing qualities of compassion and connection. The film is a direct attempt to awaken the self within the international community. It is calling on us to step into that leadership role.
Okay, so we've mapped the trauma, we've seen the absence of compassion, and we've identified the intervention. This docudrama places us, the viewers, in the position of the potential self. So the question is, by truly witnessing the extreme reality of war, are we ready to awaken the self in our own society? Understanding the source material in this explainer is just the first step. You know, taking on our responsibility as global witnesses to systemic trauma is the next. Thanks so much for joining me, and I highly encourage you to reflect on these psychological frameworks the next time you look at global events.